So, welcome to Common Ground for Texans. I'm Joanne Richards, and I'm the board president. And we look forward to a very lively discussion today on election integrity and voting rights, protection of voting rights. I should let you know that our next meeting will be in conjunction with the League of Women Voters of Austin area, and it will take place on Saturday, March 20th. And we will discuss 4 of the ballot initiatives that will be on the May 1st ballot. And on March 27th, we will coordinate with the League of Women Voters to do 4 more of the ballot initiatives. We decided that 8 ballot initiatives in 2 hours was really too many to be able to talk about it at once. So we're gonna partner with the league and have 2 back-to-back Saturday meetings and to explore what these ballot initiatives are. Early voting will begin April 19th, so that's why we have to do this in March. Without further ado, let me turn this over to our moderator, who's Mike Ignatowski. Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Joanne. And welcome everyone here. I know after last week, if you're anything like me, you'll be looking forward to Texas spring weather more than usual this year. Spring in Texas is actually very beautiful with the wildflowers blooming. And it's that time between winter and midsummer when the weather's not trying to actively kill you. But it's also a good time here to sit back and think about the big election that just happened and all the controversy. There's a lot of discussion on election integrity and fairness from the last election, with claims of voter fraud and voter suppression being made by both sides. Now, it's not our intent here to rehash the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. Most of us consider that to be a settled case, but there's a lot of lessons potentially that we could learn about things about what can be done to improve security or integrity or fairness or participation in the process. And we have 3 panel members here to discuss that. Briefly, Rose Clouston from the Voter Protection Office, Texas Democratic Party. Jennifer Richmond, founder of TruthInBetween, member of Braver Angels from Central Texas Media Action Group. And Lisa Wise, elections administrator in El Paso. I will turn it over to them in a little bit, but just remind everyone of our process here. We'll give each of the panel members several minutes to introduce themselves in a little more detail and talk about some of their initial thoughts about the election process. I know vote by mail was a big issue this past time, in part because it increased substantially due to the pandemic. But there's a lot of other issues too. And then we will go into a discussion among the panel members. I'll ask a few more questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Now, the audience members will be muted during the time just to prevent problems with background noise. But you can type your questions into the chat window, and you can do so at any time. They'll go directly to Ham Richards, and he will read and summarize the most commonly asked questions at the end of this when we get into the audience question session. So, without further ado, let's talk about what we have learned from 2020 and what are the concerns going forward. And we'll start with, Rose Clouston, from the Voter Protection Office of the Texas Democratic Party. You want to introduce yourselves a little bit more and give us your initial thoughts on what we're learning and what we're facing now?
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to all of you for joining us on a pretty nice Saturday afternoon, especially considering where we've been in the last few weeks. But really appreciate you all taking the time to spend your afternoon talking about one of the most important issues facing our democracy, right? Voting rights, and how we make sure that our elections serve voters. So my background is that I've been working in elections and voting rights for about 16 years now. This is my 5th presidential election cycle. Started in Florida in 2004, right on the heels of the Gore v. Bush debacle, which really captured my interest in voting rights and voter access, and have spent time at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, one of the preeminent civil rights organizations in the country, doing election protection work and working with voters all across the country who had questions and problems voting through their hotline, and also doing advocacy and work in a number of states, including Florida and Pennsylvania and New York. So I came to Texas about a year ago from Chicago, and so I've worked in a number of states and moved to Texas, and knew that it was going to be an uphill battle. Knew Texas's reputation for not being super friendly to voters. But over the last year, what has become incredibly apparent to me is how antiquated Texas's elections are. We have simply refused to modernize our elections and bring them into the 21st century. We are 15, 20 years behind many other states. And the reason for that is because Republicans are terrified of more people voting. They are terrified of the electorate having access to the ballot box and being able to express their opinions, because as soon as that happens, they know that they will lose. And one crystal clear example of that is online voter registration. We have had a huge coalition across the state for many years of folks asking for online voter registration, which right now more than 40 other states have, and which is a common sense reform that only saves money and makes the process more efficient and gives you better data. And you had Republican county commissions across the state asking the state legislature to make this reform because it would save their counties so much money. Like, you have, dozens of people in places like Harris County and Travis County, and El Paso too, I'm sure, typing in people's voter registration forms around the deadline for no good reason. And that's just one example of a way that this Republican legislature has refused to modernize our elections for no reason other than a misperception that it would harm their chances of reelection. When actually every other state that's done it, the studies show that no party is advantaged, just voters. Voters get the process more easily. And then, I know Mike talked a little bit about election integrity. And the thing that I would say about election integrity is that an election that has integrity is one where voters have access to it and that is transparent. And that is the bulk of the modernization work that the Democratic Party and many progressive organizations are trying to do, is to make sure that voters have access to the ballot box and that it's convenient for them to do so and that the process is transparent. What I'm not willing to do is let Republicans take a position that they have manufactured a problem of saying that our elections don't have integrity and saying that there is fraud, which has never been proven and there's no evidence to support, and then using this made up problem to justify preventing people from voting who have every right to do so. So eager to have this conversation and to delve into more nuance and get Lisa's perspective in particular of an election administrator, and just delve in with everybody.
Thanks, Rose. Let's turn over next to Jennifer Richmond. Jennifer.
Great. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. Mike, like you said, I'm not an expert on elections, so I might be a little bit out of my area here, but I often find that there is a need for a conservative voice, and a lot of times we don't have a lot of conservatives standing up to be that voice. I will tell you right now, I am not a Republican. I consider myself a classical liberal, which puts me on a conservative kind of leaning, but I'm not a Republican, so I cannot speak for Republicans. I can only speak for myself. So for me, I founded a company called TruthInBetween. And I also have a podcast called the Hold My Drink podcast, hence the fancy microphone here. But my big thing is it's really aligns with what Common Ground Texas and what Braver Angels, where I'm a board member, is a part of, is having these conversations where I feel that it's very important that we get people from both sides. So I hope that I can do some justice to what I see as a conservative voice in the discussion on election integrity. Again, this is not my line of work like Rose or like Lisa. So I'm just coming in with maybe perhaps a different perspective. One of the things I will say with that perspective is, again, not speaking as a Republican, is, in the 2000 and 2004 elections, we had the Democratic administration come in. I think it was called the Carter-Baker or the Baker-Carter Integrity Act. I don't know if the act is the right word, but commission, like right now, a lot of Republicans are trying to do to make sure that there is election integrity. So I think election integrity is truly a bipartisan perspective, a bipartisan need. What I see coming from level-headed conservatives and Republicans is they are very concerned with election security. And I see Democrats more concerned with election accessibility. And I think that those two need to come together. I think that we need to have both election accessibility and election security. And so for me, speaking again from a conservative viewpoint, I think what we've seen election fraud since Tammany Hall. Since Chicago politics. So for someone who is conservative, who actually questions an election, I don't see that as something that needs to be shied away from. And I think, as we saw with the Baker-Carter, again, if I'm saying that right, the Baker-Carter integrity after the 2004 elections, I think that's something that we need to continue to discuss. So do I think, I'll lay my ideas out right at the very beginning, do I think that this election was stolen? I do not. I do not. I absolutely do not. Do I think that there was fraud? Yeah, I think there was fraud in every election. Was it enough to overturn the Biden's win? I don't think so. At the same time, I don't fault people, particularly those who are more conservative, for saying let's have a look at this. As much as we are going to have a look at, it's important for our democracy to thrive that we have a bipartisan view of looking at how our integrity is. And I think there is a new questions of integrity, because everything felt crazy in 2020 with the pandemic and with the mail-in voting, which I think a lot of state governments weren't prepared for. And I hope that we become prepared for. I'm open to the idea of different ways of voting and different ways of accessibility. So that's kind of my view right out there.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. And our third panelist, Lisa Wise. Lisa, I'm not sure we gave you a lot of heads up about preparing for a few minutes of discussion here, but if you could introduce yourself a little bit more and give us some of your opening thoughts on the discussion, that would be great.
Sure. So, my name's Lisa Wise. I'm the El Paso County Elections Administrator. I've been an elections official for about 14 years, 8 years in Nebraska, and about 6 years here in Texas, all of those spent here in El Paso County. And I think this conversation is something that we definitely want to continue to have. I really like hearing, let's find a place between where we can join the accessibility and the security. Because as an elections administrator, right, we hear from both sides. We hear from all sides, but obviously there's two that have a lot more airtime. And so those, both sides we hear on, we need access to the ballot box. That's obviously a very big deal on one side, while the security is the internet security and the online security and things like ID are a big issue on the other side. And so for us as elections administrators, we have to do our best to, to accommodate all of that as much as we can and make sure that everything we're doing is transparent, is secure, is fair. A lot of the different, words you hear, buzzwords on election integrity. And so I think these conversations are incredibly important because I do think that there are people who maybe are not as involved in elections that go, a lot based on what they see just real quick on a 10-second news snippet, and rather than really looking at the history of elections or what it takes to actually put together an election, what actually is happening with the post-election actions that we do on security side of it, and things like that. So this year was incredibly interesting, obviously with the pandemic, and then just with everything that we were able to adjust last minute on those things to meet the needs of the voters in November.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Let me ask the panel members to comment specifically on vote by mail, because there was such a big increase last fall, due in part to the pandemic, and it created a lot of controversy. But I think it's part of a longer term trend. I looked this up beforehand. There are actually 5 states that do elections mostly by mail now, if not entirely: Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Utah, and Washington. There's a growing number of states who allow vote by mail with no excuses given. Anyone who wants to can. Texas was technically not one of those states. You still needed to claim an excuse to get a mail-in ballot. Are there genuine concerns here? Is there something that can be done to alleviate those concerns? And what do people see as the long-term trend here? Will Texas allow massive vote by mail in the foreseeable future? And the panel members can just jump in.
Well, I would love to hear from like Rose or Lisa about vote by mail and the states that did have it before the pandemic, and what their security measures have been and how we can start to implement that. For me personally, I don't have a problem with vote by mail. I think that it allows accessibility, particularly to people who are older or infirm or disabled. That said, the idea of when we can vote in person, I just feel like that's so much a part of like our civic identity. So I want us to progress, but I don't want us to lose that opportunity to vote in person, as I think is a very important public duty in a way. But I don't know much about vote by mail. So like Rose or Lisa, I would love to hear what some of the other states have done and what we did incorrectly, if we did anything incorrectly at all.
Oh, we did a lot incorrectly. Texas was one of only 5 states that did not allow any person who wanted a mail ballot to have one. Again, because this attorney general and this Republican administration is so afraid of the public voting. And it is unconscionable that I spoke to parents who had children with disabilities who were not eligible to vote by mail and had not left their house in months, and said, I have to choose between voting, including voting to expand, that my vote will help expand Medicaid and ensure health access for my child and other people in my community that need it, or stay home and protect the health of my child. Those are the choices before me. No parent should have to make that choice. That is unconscionable. And the trend that we see across the country is in expanding access to voting and giving voters options to vote when and how is convenient for them, so that mail voting is an option for anyone who wants it, that early voting, that we have a long early voting period that has hours that allow anyone who wants it to vote by mail. To vote in person early, and then election day being the last day to vote. Because I think one thing that we saw also in Harris County this year, when they tried to expand hours of early voting, and El Paso, Lisa had polling places open until 10 p.m. some days, which I would love to hear more about. But that expanded access, many Texans do not work a 9-to-5 job and have the ability to change their schedule and show up a little bit later because there's a line at the polling place or something, right? That is my privileged way that I work, but that is not the reality for many Texans. And so having evening voting hours and weekend voting hours is so important to make sure that every Texan can vote, and also to allow folks to vote by mail for whom that is the most convenient and accessible way.
Yeah, and if I can just add on a little bit of what Rose said, I mean, honestly, I come from a state that has no excuse ballot by mail. And I can tell you that the process here in Texas for ballot by mail is more complex than any state I've ever seen. And that starts with the fact that you have to make sure, even in the law, that you're supposed to be the one mailing in your application by common carrier. People can't just drop it off for you. And that's unlike a lot of states where if my dad wanted to vote by mail and I was going to go to the courthouse, I could take that application down there for him. That's not allowed, right? In a lot of states, it starts with even the application. Then once we have the ballots actually returned, we go through things like the ballot opening board, the signature verification committee, where they actually have people from both parties reviewing the signatures against different items that we have on file, whether it's the request for ballot by mail, or you can go back even to registration if the second tier committee needs to do that. So, honestly, when I was in Nebraska, the idea of this massive widespread voter fraud just did not happen. And there were a lot fewer complexities to that process. So, we have not seen anything like that. I know there's always this talk about ballot harvesting, and they use those terms to kind of get people really worked up about that. We have not seen things like that in El Paso. This is not to say there's never any examples of fraud. I mean, people can find 1, 2, 3. That's not to say that. But in a program that reaches, in our county, 200 and some thousand registered voters, and then obviously hundreds of thousands and millions across the country, these are really small numbers. They're not game-changing numbers. And so this idea that there's this widespread in mail voter fraud, we just haven't seen it. I've never seen it. I have not seen numbers to back that up. So what we're doing already in Texas, in my opinion, is the process is pretty thick, and it's very bipartisan. Like I said, you've got 2 committees who review the signatures. You're not allowed to turn in a bunch of applications for people. In Nebraska, you could be what we would call somebody who could come in and get ballots for people, like a late ballot, like the process we have here. And it was a lot less stringent. So in my opinion, I believe that the process here is very secure, with layers of security by both parties, bipartisanship on that.
I'd love to add just one more thing to Lisa's point about security, which is if there was any sort of real problem, I guarantee you this attorney general would have found it. He has made it his life's mission here in Texas, our attorney general, to prosecute voter fraud, to find issues with our election systems. And despite dedicating significant amounts of staff time and energy, has come up with paltry evidence of this. And so if this did exist, he would have found it, and that just hasn't been what we've seen.
Right. And not only would he find it, I mean, I'm sure everybody saw that. I don't want to keep going on, but that, he even offered rewards for people to find it. Right. So, and we haven't seen any real, anything from that. So it's this idea to continue to look for things and look for things and look for things. And we just have not seen anything really, what I would say really, widespread. We haven't seen it anywhere.
That's great news. I love hearing that. I mean, I was reading a Pew study the other day that was saying that in any given election or national election, there's upwards of 24 million fraudulent votes. This was coming from Pew. And again, I go back to what I was saying. I can pull it up. I can't do 2 things at once, but I'll pull it up and send it to you. But regardless, I mean, I feel like this election was fine, but there have been questions by Democratic administrations in the past on fraud. So I think my biggest problem is not that there is fraud, because I feel like this was this election, particularly under the circumstances, was done quite well. But it feels like, coming from a conservative perspective, that this turn of kind of anger and angst towards anyone conservative even questioning, when we've seen, Democrat administrations question electoral integrity in the past years. So I think that's where some people kind of feel like, whoa, there's a lot of ire towards anyone who would question that. And I think that's why a lot of times you have a lot of problems finding a conservative voice, because they just don't want to be the one that's in the spotlight, for having even a question of our democracy, when this has been, I think, questioning our democracy and questioning our democratic processes is something that we should be doing, and doing it in a smart, bipartisan forum, much like we're doing here. But I just, I see that there's a lot of people who don't want to have these conversations because it feels very ugly right now.
Sure.
Just
And
quick
I can
informational point.
go ahead.
Sorry, that 24 million figure that you just used is inaccurate. It is 24 million registrations that might not be accurate, which is not equivalent to people voting. Just because someone, I might still be registered in Chicago by accident because they didn't, properly communicate. That has nothing to do with me actually voting there or there being an improper vote. So inaccurate voter rolls are something I know Joanne wants to talk about a little bit later, but there is no such study indicating that there were fraudulent votes to that.
Right. Inaccurate voter rolls. Thank you. Yes. I knew I did something.
And that's
wrong.
a huge issue. I mean, I'm like you said, I'm sure we'll touch up on that, but I can tell you, I'll just tell you, my parents, kind of started to have this belief on things like voter fraud and things like that. And my dad asked me 4 years ago, when President Trump won, do you think that that election was stolen, that people got in and messed with the system? I did not think that 4 years ago, and I do not think it 2 months ago. Okay. That is not, in my opinion, what's going on here. I mean, when we talk about 4 years ago, a lot of that stuff to me is, misinformation, people giving out wrong polling sites or things like that, or talking about deadlines for voting. There are people who actively try to do that around every election. But really, in talking with DHS and even our local FBI, misinformation is really the number one way to affect a voter, an election, whether that it has people stay home because, somebody said the election was, everybody thinks it's funny to be like, my opponent's voters should come out on Monday. Just so you know, Democrats election day is Monday, and they think that's funny. It's not funny to me. So, things like that, that's kind of what starts this misinformation. And so, again, whatever side of the aisle on, or whether you're straight down the middle of the aisle, I definitely, I don't believe that happened 4 years ago. I don't believe it happened 2 months ago.
So let me ask Jennifer, I'll put you on the spot a little bit here.
I'm used to it.
What would you say are the most valid concerns that conservatives tend to have about election integrity? And what do you think they would point to as the biggest improvements that they could see in the coming years that we should make?
Gosh, that's a really good question, Mike. I think that there are concerns about security. I think there are concerns about the, particularly in this year, where a lot of states had not previously dealt with the mail-in votes, as we saw in this year, that they were not ready for that. I think there were, and I think Lisa may have said this, or I'm sorry if it was Rose. I mean, there are that I've been able to find personally. And again, I'm not really tied to this issue as a conservative of election integrity. I think we did things really well. But, you do hear those stories of, there was a woman in San Antonio who was caught, here in Texas with harvesting ballots. The Project Veritas actually picked her up on tape, going around and getting people to change their votes and whatnot. And it was easier to do because she could, in mail-in votings, go before they actually mailed it in, visit them. Was that minimal? Did that change the election? No, I don't think it did. I think, but I think it serves all of us Democrat or Republican, conservative or progressive, to make sure that we have dotted those I's and crossed those T's. Because we've seen, and I would disagree a little bit with Rose. I don't think that, and I actually disagree with my husband, who is a Republican, by the way. He thinks that the Republicans are over. I don't think that they are. I think they've got a moment. But I see, and Rose, I mean, when you do this, I think we need both sides. We need both sides. And I hope the Republicans, I hope that we clean up our act. And I don't mean we as in, because I'm not Republican. I think as Americans that we clean up our act where we're not so polarized. But I think that we absolutely need both sides. And if we don't have both sides, then there aren't those checks and balances. So anyways, Mike, I'm sorry I got away from your original, I was responding to some things earlier. But I think the biggest concern is this concern that there isn't a concern. So it's okay. It's a concern when it's, a Democratic administration, 2000, 2004. But when Republicans have a question, oh, hey, maybe this wasn't right. Then all of a sudden it's like, well, you're dumb, you're stupid. It was because of Trump. And Trump did exacerbate things. And Trump exacerbated things quite a bit for people who consider themselves conservative and not Trumpers. And there's quite a few of those people out there in the world. I know that, we always hear the loudest voices. And so anyone who's considered conservative is considered a Trump supporter. And that's simply not the case. And Trump's words made it very difficult to make a sound argument from a conservative perspective for election integrity, because he just didn't have much integrity, in my opinion of Jennifer Richmond, not of the conservatives. And so I think that's where it got things confused as well. Did I answer? Did I go there? I hope I answered your question.
Sure. Well, I just want to say I'm sure all the panel members have strong opinions on Donald Trump, and trying not to make this discussion a discussion about Donald Trump.
Yeah.
I want to put Rose and Lisa on the spot now. There's a concern about the voter registration rolls, and Joanne has asked this specifically about how you ensure they're valid, and how should a government clean them up in a reasonable way and check for inaccuracies. I'll put that up to Rose and Lisa to comment on, and then Jennifer can add anything she wants to.
Rose, I don't care if you want to start or you want me to start.
I'd love you to start with I think you have the best perspective here on, how that works currently and what that looks like. So please.
Okay. So a couple things, well, actually several things, which is that, the best way to have clean rolls is to keep up with them daily. Okay. We have a lot of information we receive every single day in our office. And a lot of times people will say, well, we'll wait till Fridays, or we'll wait till once on the first of the month and things like that. We really try in our office to clean those rolls as best as we can with the most accurate of information, right? So we make sure that any of the deceased abstracts we get from our clerk's office, we work on those immediately. We make sure any matches we have that require a letter to be sent out, something like a felon or something like that, we get on that immediately. We don't let things pile up. We try to get through anything we can. Across the country, there's probably over a decade ago, they really started to push this cross-state check, right? Where you've got this program called ERIC is the one that is being used right now mostly. And that's where, instead of us just basically having access to Texas registrations, we're able to try and look at other states, at least around you, to keep up with that information. The issue there with ERIC is, one, how accurate is it, right? And then two, once we start having like this national database almost of voter registrations, that people are afraid that becomes kind of a target, right? That if this is a place right now, if somebody were to come in and want to really shut down elections in every state, they basically have to go down to the county level Because like even our registration, although we work with the state of Texas, we're what's called an offline county. We do our stuff in-house. And so, there's all these little pockets. There's not a massive way to really do it. And so there's this call to have this national database that you cross-check with, but at the same time, how do we make sure that's not something that people, go after and things like that. So for us, really, it's just keeping on it every day and making sure that we are, when we enter information, we have a 3-check system now, where basically you enter it, someone checks that, and then someone goes back and checks the check. It takes longer. There's no doubt about that, but we catch stuff, right? We catch stuff from, just fat fingering, data entry, things like that. And so it's really just attention to detail, having enough staff, sticking with it, and then involving the voter whenever you can, whenever we're allowed to send a letter, whenever we're allowed to reach out, whenever we're allowed. There's a lot of legislation in the going up this year that allows us to contact voters on maybe applications or registrations for ballot by mail, that there's an error. Instead of having them start all over again, we can contact them and clean up our rolls with that. So things like online voter registration, it would be something that, in my opinion, I think helps with those errors as well. You don't have 5 people, passing the registration around. You've got the person entering it, there's checks. It still has to do a live match at the state level. And then we get it imported daily like we do now with some stuff. So, those are my suggestions to keep with it, and don't fall behind. And have a lot of people checking, a lot of checks.
Yeah, to pick up on that, I would say one of the best ways to get our voter rolls accurate is to modernize the systems, like Lisa said, with online voter registration, because my full name is Rosemarie with an IE at the end. And anytime someone reads it, they turn it into Rosemary with a Y at the end instead of the IE. So if someone is keying that in and moving quickly, it is much more likely that they're going to misspell it. Whereas I have been spelling my name for 35 years and, going to get it right when I type it in. So that sort of thing, to keep it accurate, is having the voter have that ownership and ability to do that data entry directly. And also allowing folks to do those updates, like Lisa said, online, whether it's, I move from Austin to Houston, that I can make that change online, just like I change where my mail goes online and, sign up for my utilities and everything else as part of that moving process, that I can just do that online. Because one of the things that we really saw this year is like, nobody has a printer. So if I have to send in a paper application form, that is it like gets to the bottom of the list, because I got to go like find a printer and deal with that. And it just like is much more complex, and not the way that people do business now, not the way that we are used to living our lives. So it ends up not happening. And that person ends up staying registered in Austin and not getting registered in Houston. The other thing is to automate things as much as possible. So automatic voter registration, which just means that if I go to the DMV, right now I can say, yes, please register me. It would just change that from an opt-in to an opt-out, where the default is that I update my address and get registered to vote, rather than having to check the box to say yes. I have to check the box to say no. And ideally, we do that at many other government agencies as well. If I, am signing up for food stamps or signing up for Medicaid, that same process would happen, and I would get automatically registered to vote. And all that means is that my information is accurate in the county that I live in, and then I have the choice to vote or not when the time comes, rather than scrambling. And I'm sure Lisa has experienced this in her office, where you got a ton of applications right around that October 5th deadline, which makes it much harder on your office during a very busy time, and makes it less accurate. All of us make more mistakes when we're hurried and frantic and trying to do things on a deadline like that. And the last part that I would say is, one of the things that is required by the National Voter Registration Act, a federal law, is basically that if you have an indication that someone should not be registered to vote, that maybe mail comes back to your office that you send to me, or there's some other indication that I'm no longer living there, that you have to wait 2 federal elections before you can remove me from the rolls. Because as we all became painfully aware this year, the U.S. Postal Service is not perfect and has issues. And so you want to make sure that there are guards against removing somebody too soon or without full information, because then they, I'm like, oh, I voted last election, last presidential election. Many folks only vote in presidentials, as much as we're trying to change that. And they show up and like, oh, I'm still here, I still live here, and then they're not registered. That is very disempowering and discouraging for that voter, as well as obviously disenfranchises their vote. So we do want to make sure that that time safeguard is also in place and continues to be in place.
Any other comments, Jennifer?
Joanne, you were going to say something.
Well, I have a practical question. When my mother passed away, one of the things that was on my checklist of things to do was to notify the Secretary of State in Pennsylvania that she died and therefore could no longer vote. But I don't know how you find out. How do you find out that people have died?
So, I can't speak to the state of Pennsylvania because, again, elections are different every state. But here in Texas, we receive information from the Texas Secretary of State from Vital Statistics. We receive about a weekly update from our county clerk's office for people who have become deceased because they have death certificates that go through the clerk's office. So they send us what's called an abstract, usually once a week. The pandemic has slowed it down a little bit, but and so we have those, and we update our lists according to the information we get from state vital statistics and then our county.
It's interesting that Rose brought up the concern about privacy in a national voter registration database. There are people who claim half jokingly, and only half jokingly, that Facebook can predict how you're going to vote in the 2022 election right now better than you can. So why not just turn the whole process over to them? Okay, assuming we're not going to do that, I want to finish with one final question before we turn it over to the audience questions. So get your fingers typing if you have questions you want to ask. And that final question from me is, what is your biggest concern going forward with election integrity and election fairness? And we'll go in reverse order from how we started. So Lisa, do you want to? Yeah.
Okay, I guess my biggest concern is voter apathy, is our voters who are seeing this play out and deciding, look, this is just, it's not worth it, right? I mean, I don't want to have, whether I do believe that the election isn't secure, I don't want my vote not to be secure, or whether I do believe it's a hassle to have to ballot to vote by mail or go have one drop spot or register 30 days out or whatever, that may be. And that hasn't changed, right? I mean, voter apathy as an election official, as somebody who's always been involved in elections their entire adult life, has always been my number one concern. I think that those are things that happen. Voter apathy is the result of these issues, is the result of the question on security, the result of the question on access. So, I think all we can continue to do is address questions, remedy situations however we can. We always get questions about, well, how come there's people who are 120 on the rolls and things like that? And, we answer those questions about the legacy birthday where, in the 70s, you didn't have to put a birth date on there. And so the state handed out this legacy birth year and everybody used January 1, 1901. But every election, I answer the same question. How come there's 110-year-olds? How come there's 120-year-olds? And it's the same exact situation every time. But you have to have those conversations. You have to address them. You have to, when someone asks, tell me the process about ballot by mail, because, I don't want to have that. I can just fill out 50 ballot by mail and someone's going in. Okay. Then we go through that. We talk about the post-election audit. I think as long as you can continue to get information out there, you'll have people who are more comfortable with the process. The more comfortable they are, the more likely they are to vote. And that's my concern, is I don't want people to be turned off from participating in elections because of, and it's not just this year. Trust me. We remember 2000. We remember, there's been a lot of time in between there but depending on what side you're on, you question the process. So that's my fear, is people just dropping out altogether and saying, what's the point?
Thank you. Jennifer, your biggest concern going forward?
Wow. Well, first of all, Lisa, thank you so much for the work you do. I can't even imagine the frustrations that you must go through day in, day out with this. I am not concerned at all about us updating the way we elect. I think that we need to get into the 21st century. I think we do need to have our online registration and whatnot. What I would like to see, or I guess what my concern is that as we update these processes, making it more accessible to more people, which I think is incredibly important, I still really feel, and we didn't really get into to voter ID, but I think that when someone is able to register online or vote in mail, that needs to be verified, why that is. I think that most people really should still vote in person. Again, I just feel like that's a civic duty. I feel like there is, as far as IDs go, it's not hard to get one. To assume that most people can't get one is actually kind of, what's the word I want to use? Infantilizing a lot of people. So I feel like we need to really encourage this civics in our classrooms. I think we've lost that in our classrooms, and my concern is that there's a lot of movements like Generation Citizen that are trying to put civics back in, but I think the apathy that Lisa mentioned, and I think part of that apathy is because we're not really putting that civics into our education system. And then for me, I think part of that civics is actually showing up. I think we have to move forward, and we have to. We are a digital era right now, so we have to change the way that we vote. But I think that maybe that's why I consider myself conservative. That's my traditional side speaking. I think showing up is important to me, and I worry that we won't.
Thank you, Jennifer.
I think going back to something that Jennifer said before, I agree that we need robust political debate in this country and that there should be more than one political party. What I don't believe is that that one of those political parties should be able to not base itself in fact and reality. And one of the things, and that leads to my biggest concern about our elections, which is that conservatives and Republicans throw out baseless questions with no evidence and that about our election systems and use that as an excuse to restrict access, particularly for Black and Brown communities. And that is what we've seen time and again. President Trump formed a commission to try to investigate voter fraud in 2017. And you know what? It came up with squat. It was disbanded because they couldn't come up with it because it isn't a real problem. But now we want to continue to use those baseless allegations to make it harder for people to vote. And that is what scares me the most about our elections moving forward. And the other thing that I'm looking at this audience, and we are mostly white folks who, are probably of a certain access, obviously, with our ability to be online now and have a leisurely Saturday to do this. And the reality that I saw is that voters of color did perceive our election in 2020 differently, right? Like I heard a lot of white folks kind of joking around about the vote by mail restrictions and like feeling like they could kind of massage them to be able to vote by mail. But communities of color lived in real fear of prosecution by this attorney general and from this state if they so much as stepped a toe out of line. And that does have a basis in reality. When you look at who this attorney general has chosen to prosecute for fraud and who to investigate and all of those things, it is not generally white folks. It is folks of color, and that is intentional and that is felt in those communities. And I am afraid of what that intimidation looks like and how that continues to be felt. And that our privilege will blind us to those challenges and those differences, that because I live across the street from a DPS location and I can go get my license, that I assume that is true for everybody else, when a very thorough voter ID trial over the course of years, 5 years ago or so, made it very clear that the Texas legislature knew that it was disenfranchising Black and Brown folks with our voter ID law and chose to do that anyway, because they were also closing DPS locations in Black and Brown communities. So I think that we need to be very aware of how these laws and these proposals affect folks who don't look like us and don't have the same lives as us differently, and make sure that we are not oblivious to that as we are making policy and advocating for it.
Great, thank you, Rose. I'd like to turn this over to other questions now. Joanne, you have the privilege of any questions you want to ask as the president of the organization. And if not, we'll go to Ham Richards, who will do the audience questions.
Ham has my audience question.
I do, yes. I guess I should start with them first. The first of Joanne's questions is, what are the best practices for cleaning voter rolls?
And we
I
did
guess
that
this-
one already. So
We've done that one well enough?
Yeah.
Okay. Her other question is, how do we assure that nursing home ballots are completed by the voter and not by someone else? Or is this not a problem?
Sorry, am I on mute? A couple things that I'll just say about that is that, there's this idea, I think that, there was one or two cases, I think, in Dallas County that had some nursing home, some issues with that. I would argue that, if you're going to be running a nursing home, you obviously want to make sure that anything that's going on in there is regulated and watched. But my other point on that is that it's the same way anybody's by mail ballot is filled out by that voter, which is they sign the oath. Somebody who lives in a nursing home should not have less rights to vote by mail than somebody who's just living in their own home. And so you don't want to all of a sudden start adding more steps for them to have to go through. It's, the voter signs an oath when they go in to vote in the polling site. The voter signs an oath when they vote by mail. And, I think with the ballot by mail, because of all the signature matching and things like that, it's actually more stringent of a process than even going to the polls, frankly. And so, honestly, I think it's the same way any voter does, which is that they sign the oath, that they are the ones, in fact, who voted it. We match the signature just like we do any other ballot by mail. And again, I can speak to my county specifically. We have not had an issue with that.
So anyone else want to comment on that question, or should we go on to the next one? Okay, Cindy Weatherby has a question. This one's for Lisa also. Can you describe how online updates on addresses to DPS get to your office for action? I've received my new license, but I have not received my new voter registration certificate. Does it go through the Secretary of State or directly to counties?
They'll come to us from the DPS. So sometimes it's every other day, sometimes it's twice a week. It depends when they get a big batch, what they would call the batch of voter registration updates. They send them to us, and then we input those, and then we'll send the certificates out. Now, I can tell you the DPS, at least on the process of sending us our information, is a little bit behind with the pandemic. However, if you have waited, by law, we send those out 30 days, within 30 days of registration. So if it's been 45 days, 50 days, let us know. We can go back and check with the DPS and make sure they sent it to us. But this is a perfect example of something that, happens sometimes. We don't maybe get the DPS right away, or something happens. And so that's why it's so important to understand, to call us, to make sure that we're able to get you whatever you need as soon as we can. So definitely give us a call, and I can look into that for someone if it's been over 30 days.
Okay, I guess I'll ask the next question. There seems to be a widespread belief that there are millions of people that are just champing at the there seem to be there's an assumption that there are millions of people that are just really eager to vote fraudulently. But the federal penalty for election fraud is up to 5 years in prison. What sort of motivation could offset that risk? Anybody have a comment on that?
I'll just say, clearly people who believe that have never knocked on a door or made a phone call to try to convince somebody to vote, because getting folks to vote once is hard enough, right? we have low voter turnout in Texas compared to comparable states, and many candidates, political parties on both sides work very hard to turn those voters out. And also, though, to have robust data systems so that once you voted early, I'm taking you off my list. I ain't got time to talk to you anymore. I got to move on to someone who can still vote, right? So that, to your point, Ham, yes, there is a significant penalty, and there's no evidence to show that that happens or that there's any motivation or like reason for that to happen. Because I can certainly assure you that campaigns, it is not worth it, right? Like you would never make that encouragement or do that work, because it's, if you ever try to keep secrets in politics, sure as hell don't work. And a massive voter fraud conspiracy be the secret of all secrets that ain't staying secret. So I just don't see any basis for that. But
Okay, I'll ask another one since there aren't any others. The question is, how do we rebuild trust in elections integrity in the face of massive propaganda sowing distrust? The Federal Kobach Commission disbanded after finding absolutely zero fraud in the 2016 election, where the president at the time, the president-elect, claimed massive fraud, and they couldn't find any. Republican election officials and Trump-appointed judges found no significant fraud in the 2020 election. Yet so many people still believe the 2020 election was stolen. Do we just give up on trying to convince people with evidence? How do we persuade people to see reality, or is that just a lost cause?
I mean, I don't want to give up. So for me, it's getting out as often as you can, talking to as many people as you can. And a lot of times it even starts in your small circle. Like I said, I mean, I've had to go over post-election audits with my dad, 3 election cycles, explaining to him what the ballot marking device is different than the DRE, explaining to them about the legacy birthdays. And in my opinion, I want to get it to a point where when somebody sees incredibly outrageous propaganda, they're more likely to say, there's no way, right? There's no way, instead of, or let me go, I want to look at that. I want to see really what is that saying, instead of just buying this headline and going and going and going. I don't think giving up is an option. I think you have to go completely the other way, which is just continue with information, continue with evidence, continue having the discussions, so that when someone asks about, ballot drop spots and is this secure and how was this done, you're answering their questions. And, we have people who call our office who are just so sure that what they saw was this or what they saw was that. And I'll explain to them about provisional voting, and I'll explain to them about state of residence. And I mean, just kind of going through and telling them, look, this is what happens. I have people come to my office all the time to just look at things like, oh, let me show you this and let me show you that. And honestly, a lot of times that's enough. They just want to have their questions answered, and not just shoved aside. And to me, that's at least part of my job, is making sure that if they have questions, we have answers. We do this program in schools even now. We've got a middle school, an elementary, and a high school curriculum where we go in and do register, research, remember to vote. And it's just talking about what our program is and trying to start a habit that early so that they are critical thinkers and look past headlines and things like that. So it's a long answer to the question, but definitely not give up, go completely the other way. Keep pushing, keep going.
It's absolutely.
You find that your one-on-one conversations with skeptics are successful in persuading them?
Mm-hmm.
That's good to hear.
And I mean, I've had one-on-ones with skeptics who sued our office. And then once those lawsuits have been thrown out because there's no real validity to them, they've sat down with the issues they had and we've gone over them. And some of them have had ideas, well, if you would, if this was kind of explained better like this, And I'll take that idea and go with it if I think it's something that it will help the public. Because I mean, I come from a place of probably too much in election knowledge in a way that it's hard to always know, okay, what do people want to know? What do people not know? And so, talking with people, even skeptics, I learn a lot from them, and I think we both learn from each other.
Great.
Did you want to jump in, Jennifer?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, I'm just seconding what Lisa said. I think it's these conversations, and then Lisa, I love hearing what you were saying of taking this information to the schools. I mean, that's one of the things that I do as well. Is we have to have these conversations, and this is where I get back into like the civics in our schools, where we aren't teaching our kids to be critical thinkers. And I mean, I think it's just so easy in this internet era of outrage and of media manipulation. And so having these conversations, I always laugh and say in my podcast that I miss like fireside chats. And I would love it if we had like a fireside chat with Lisa, that people could come in every week and like listen to what you've done that week to make sure that everything, this conversation, and make it public. So everything that we can do to publicize the work that you're doing, because there's a trust deficit on both sides. And until we have these real conversations, because the trust deficit is not going to be, we're not going to approach it through media. The trust deficit has to only be approached in conversations like this. So
I would add one thing to that, which is we didn't just come to we all, yes, Facebook, yes, Twitter, all of that. But let's be honest about where the source of this came from, which is our Republican elected officials chose to claim that this election was stolen in order to benefit themselves politically. And that was a choice that they made because they thought that would be helpful for their careers. We have to make them pay both a political and a legal price for that. We have to hold those folks who perpetuated that lie, including Senator Cruz, accountable for that. And then we have to make them pay a political price by booting their butts out of office and making sure that they do not have a position of authority and public trust again. Because we cannot held those folks up who just lied for their own political gain to be in that position. Yes, there's other things amplified that, but they were the ones making the news and saying it to start. And then for the rest of us, we also need to share the good, boring news, right? When Lisa's office puts out a press release that says we just finished our audit and it was great and this is what happened, we need to share that stuff on Facebook and on Twitter too, right? Because it's the sensational stuff that Lisa and Jennifer were talking about that gets the news and it gets the likes and the shares. And we need to also make sure that the boring stuff is there. And the last thing that I would just encourage everyone to do about this process is become a poll worker, become an election clerk, right? Have your own experience in that polling place and see how it works and how complicated it is and interact with voters, and then tell your whole community about it, right? Share your lived experience, because it's a lot harder for someone to say, oh, this was going wrong or they did this wrong or whatever, when it's their neighbor and that they know and trust who was the one signing them in and, helping the process.
I love that, Rose. I think almost it should be mandatory for our kids to work that way. My only thing to you though, I would say is I don't believe I wouldn't put all the emphasis on Republicans. I mean, we've got a lot of Democrats who also have claimed fraud in the past. Most recently, Stacey Abrams as well. So I think it's a bipartisan problem. And if we're going to hold the Republicans, which I do not disagree with you, accountable for this latest round, then we also have to make sure that we hold everyone accountable, including when Democrats do that as well. So I wouldn't make it a partisan issue. But I totally agree that we should have our high school kids. That should be mandatory for them to graduate, is to be a poll worker.
So one of the things that I will share with you is I was an election judge for, 12 years maybe. And I served in an elementary school. And unfortunately now elementary schools are being removed from poll places because of security of too many people who are not associated with the school coming through schools and so forth. But it was fun because kids would go to recess and they would come right by the polling place and they poke their head in and say, what are you doing? And we would all bring them all in, if it was a slow time, and explain the process. So we could have sort of and on the just an opportunity that we can't have any longer. And I've only in the 10 years, 12 years that I served as a judge, I only had to turn away one couple from not being able to vote. And they were new immigrants, and they didn't realize that you had to register to vote in the state in order to be able to vote. And so we went through that whole process of, how long it would take, and, you had to be a citizen. And so we had a one-on-one civics lesson right there, and that was a lot of fun. So.
I have a question from Char Dyson. Each county is independent, and people in Republican counties that are Democratic seem not to trust their election office. Is there truth in their fears?
I mean, it's hard for me to speak to any other election office besides my own. But there's no truth in those fears. I mean, I've been there 6 years. Everything we do bipartisan. Even on elections that are our local elections that are nonpartisan, I still make sure we have people from both parties represented. I still make sure they're active on the committees. I make sure they're active on the boards. We hire what we call rovers or supervisors that are past judges who've been really fabulous. We pick from both parties. And I can tell you, in the county I live in, it can be very hard to find people from both parties. In El Paso is very one party. But we do everything we can to make sure that they are both parties are represented, even when we don't need to. We make sure to include as many people as we can from both of the parties.
Judd Rogers has a question. How do we enable and incentivize voters to keep their registration accurate?
I think this just goes to some of the conversation we had earlier about keeping the voter rolls accurate and making it, more electronic, more convenient, where more one-stop shop and automatic would be my recommendations.
Mary Cullinane has a comment rather than a question, but maybe the panelists would like to comment on her comment. She says, in public health, we always say, make the right choice the easy choice. Customer service is all about solving problems and making use of a company's product easy. That is how I see online registration and other interventions to make registration and voting easy and more likely to improve turnout. I love going to the polls on election day, but not everyone wants to or is able to go. I think that if we want people to participate in our democracy, we have to make it easy for them to do it.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with all of that, definitely. And I myself love to go to the polls as well. Unfortunately, since I have had become an elections official, that's not really been the way I've been able to do it. I've had to do early voting, but for a long time I was a purist, I would say, and only voted on election day. But that didn't happen, and so. When we talk about make the right choice the easy choice, I agree with that. I mean, I want to make voting as easy as possible, make registering as easy as possible, make changing information as easy as possible. Because when it's easy for the voters, it's easier for us in our office for sure.
Pat Hurden has a long question, so hang on and we'll get to the question mark at the end. He says, I've been through elections in Tallahassee, Sacramento, and Austin, one each census and redistricting year for Florida and California, and now 4 in Texas. The census is very short counted this year, for example, in Texas, and the next decade of power is determined by redistricting. In addition, we have digital deserts in some urban areas and across rural areas. So how do these various factors affect who will actually vote? and the security of elections, particularly in redistricting cycles. How does media disinformation differentially affect these various communities with different access to voting and the very political process itself at state levels?
Well, this
Anyone?
is a long question. I'm just going to answer a little bit because I'm sure Rose can answer on that statewide issue. But, you know, whenever you're right, it's undercounted. This year is going to be probably incredibly undercounted because of the pandemic. And we're still waiting. Everything's been pushed back, right? The numbers that we normally would have now, we're not going to get, the state's not going to get till September. And at our level, at the election precinct level, we use registered voters, right? So we want to make sure in our election precincts that nobody has more than 5,000 registered voters. When you undercount, when you do something, we may not know that, you know, there's that many people in this precinct. We could draw a precinct with a polling site and there's actually double that. You know, we don't know if they're undercounted. And initially that money helps with the funding, right, on schools and parks and a lot of the things that people depend on. So it just, there's a lot of ways that undercounting will negatively affect the state. But for an election standpoint, from here in El Paso, we'll probably lose a House seat. We already are very far from Austin, so we don't have a lot of, we don't have a ton of clout when we are out there. And so we'll lose a House seat probably, again, depending on what those election precincts look like. We're planning to go down much lower than 5,000, just because we know that there's going to be some undercounting. But it affects, it's like a domino effect. It affects one, funding, and that affects this, and the drawing at the state level affects our drawing. And so it's there, it touches on a lot of things.
I would agree with all of that. And I think there's a lot in this question. And quite frankly, I think there are dissertations being written to get to the piece about disinformation. So not going to be able to address that in full, but I think I would just encourage all of you to get involved in the redistricting process and go in. The state Senate is having hearings. They still have, I think, one hearing statewide upcoming that people can testify at virtually. Tell them what your community looks like, what the challenges in your community are, what the boundaries of your community are, to help them draw those maps and do it the right way, because that is an important part of this process. And you participating can help be the fuel that we are worried that process is going to be shortchanged on the back end. Once they draw an initial map and stuff, that there won't be a robust participatory process because of the timing and as an excuse potentially. But so please go and participate in that process now. Because, surely if we don't believe that our representatives are representing us and we don't believe that they can lose through our actions because, of gerrymandered districts and those sorts of things, then people are less likely to vote, right? You see competitive elections have higher turnout. We saw in 2017, that was one of the real lessons from Virginia in their state house races. Every single state house race across the state was contested, and you saw the impact on turnout statewide, that because there were candidates locally who were having a campaign and talking to voters and sharing information, that bumped up turnout across the state and even at the gubernatorial level. And so that sort of competitiveness can be very helpful in that regard. And that certainly goes to the redistricting point that this question was asking.
Anyone else want to comment on that one? Well, I've got one more question. It's my own question for people who are in favor of vote by mail, and that is, what do you do about the lack of privacy of voting by mail? That is, the inability to be sure that no one can see your ballot. If your boss, for example, says, you could request a mail-in ballot, and I want you to do that, and I want you to fill it out while I'm looking over your shoulder. Or a spouse could say the same thing. Or somebody could offer money for your mail-in ballot. How do you offset the risk of those with benefits for universal vote by mail?
I'll just talk real quick on that. And that's that, all of those things that you're saying are obviously violations of the election code. So, I mean, this is somebody who's got to be willing to, as we talked about before, go to jail, pay thousands of dollar fines. And I would argue if anybody felt like that, I mean, it's not just ballot by mail, right? When you come in, if you want an assistant to help you in the polling site, it can't be your union boss. It can't be your employer. And so if somebody were to say, bring in your ballot by mail so that I can see how you're voting, that's a much bigger issue, in my opinion, than the secrecy of the ballot, because you've got somebody who's trying to influence the vote. In that case, I mean, could that happen anywhere? Yes, but I would tell you that if that ever did happen, if someone contacted our office or contacted the sheriff's office, I mean, that's incredibly serious. But we have people who have told us before, oh, they used to tell us that we would get free lunch if we went in to vote, and came out and told them who we voted for, right? So, I mean, that is not new. It's a little bit different because of the ballot itself, but these are not new things. And the issue there is really the influencing of the vote, the pressuring, and when someone's voting by mail, obviously, unless they're something like that were to happen. I mean, once you mail it, you're in a secrecy envelope. It's in a secure envelope with the signature across the flap. It's open and separated from the envelope immediately once we are able to open. And so there's no way to trace it back, done by, people of two different parties. So on our end, I think it's, I don't think you have to worry about the secrecy of that. But if that were to be happening to a voter, whether it's at a polling site or by mail, I mean, it doesn't matter. That's serious. And that would be something that we would want to punish by law. But I'm not sure if there's a specific way to stop someone from doing that from ballot by mail any different than at a polling site, which is just report, anything if something like that were to happen, see something, say something.
Well, that is a point in favor of voting in person, that the privacy of the voting booth works both ways. It protects the voter against pressure to vote in a certain way because nobody can tell.
Right. You could tell people you voted for however you wanted to.
Sure, and they can't tell.
No.
I mean, I would just say to that, like, we can come up with fantastical scenarios about any which way that, our election laws could be circumvented or anything. We've all watched a lot of Law and Order and NCIS and things in our day, right? Where you can come up with different ways that things can be circumvented. But, we, like you mentioned earlier, we have seen there are 5 states that vote almost entirely by mail. And many other states that have no excuse absentee voting. And we just haven't seen these things come into reality and manifest themselves. So I don't think that, the what ifs should be used to supersede a voter's need for access to the ballot when we do have evidence from many other places. Like, it's not like Texas is at the forefront of anything election related, where we're the ones paving the way and trying it out for the first time. So we have plenty of evidence from other states that we can look to show us kind of what the path is and how to do these things well and provide voters access at the same time.
Joanne Richards has a question. Are there any countries that have a holiday on election day?
Yes, there are.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Rose.
It is a holiday in many countries, particularly in Europe. In Australia, you have mandatory voting where there is actually a penalty if you do not vote. I think the concern in the United States, I'm personally kind of on the fence about whether making Election Day a holiday is beneficial. I think while it could be helpful in recruiting poll workers and having access to facilities like schools, I think those are reasons that it would be beneficial. But when we think about folks who have a challenge in getting to the polling place and having the time off to vote, generally those folks are the same folks who get a holiday, or those are not the folks who get a holiday off, right? A federal holiday are like service workers who work at, Chipotle and HEB and all these different things. My dad worked at a grocery store his whole career. He never got a federal holiday off, right? So I just don't know that we would actually be solving a participation problem with that solution.
And I agree with Rose.
Yeah.
For us, when we think about having a holiday, it's merely to have access to buildings that would normally be open and deny us use or not be able to give us the best space. School is a perfect example. And then also having some poll workers who would be able to work with us. But, you know, we have a lot of our elections on Saturdays. And now obviously those are our local elections, which don't see the turnout that a federal election would anyway, but it's still, the Saturday still doesn't bring in what I would say voters who would not normally have voted.
I think Travis County's 2 weeks of early voting, including evenings and weekends, solves every problem that a voting holiday would solve and does it better.
So it is hard on Zoom meetings to go much more than an hour. It's tiring for people. So I think it'd be a good time to start wrapping this up here. I really want to thank our panel members today, and Jennifer, Rose, and Lisa, and all of those who stuck around from the audience to become better informed citizens on this lovely day. I really appreciate your effort. I really appreciate your interest in what's going on in the country and wanting to stay informed. Joanne, do you want to say any final words to remind people of next month?
Well, the only thing that I will say is next month, we're devoting 2 meetings with the League of Women Voters again, and we're doing this on March 20th and March 27th to talk about the May 1st proposition ballot, so that when people do go vote, and we will encourage people to vote because it does affect you locally, that we want you to become informed.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you again next month.
Thank you all. Thank you all very, very, very much.